किताबवाला में आज की हमारी मेहमान दुनिया की जानी मानी ऑथर नॉवलिस्ट, नाम है एलिफ शफक। इनकी सबसे पॉपुलर बुक है द 40 रूल्स ऑफ लव। आई एम गोइंग टू इंटरव्यू यू। दे ऑल स्टार्टेड स्क्रीमिंग, व्हाट आर यू श्योर, आर यू रियली गोना डू इट, एंड दे आर सो हैप्पी। सो थैंक यू so much. You are very popular. You are a rock star for us.
Everything you said really means a lot to me. Thank you.
Have you ever felt any kind of political pressure while living in UK or any other country that I have to be careful if I'm going to criticize, how will it be received? Is there a factor that the kind of time and space you are living in, how will it appear and how the regime will react to it?
I try to remain in that imaginary world for as long as I can and as deep as I can. That world becomes my reality. Those imaginary characters become my companions, you know? I live with them and I forget the so-called real world.
How do you look at memory as a tool, and why is it so important for us, the people of letters, to preserve the memory?
I observe many families who are either immigrants or have experienced some kind of displacement or some kind of trauma, come from complex backgrounds.
Authoritarianism and patriarchy, they often mirror each other. So the notion to control a woman's body and the notion to control a nation, they are almost parallel.
Where are the stories of women? What was life like for a peasant woman or a concubine or a prostitute? In the Ottoman Empire, there's a big silence.
नमस्ते, मेरा नाम सौरभ द्विवेदी है। ये लल्लनटॉप का सबसे चमकीला कार्यक्रम है, किताबों का कार्यक्रम, नाम किताबवाला। किताबवाला में आज की हमारी मेहमान दुनिया की जानी मानी ऑथर नॉवलिस्ट, नाम है एलिफ शफक। इनकी सबसे पॉपुलर बुक है द 40 रूल्स ऑफ लव, जो आपको स्क्रीन पर इस वक्त नजर आ रही है। लेकिन आज हम अपनी मेहमान एलिफ शफक से जिस किताब पर बात करने जा रहे हैं वो है इनका लेटेस्ट नॉवेल, देयर आर रिवर्स इन द स्काई। चार किरदार, हजारों बरस में फैली कहानी। कहानी जो पानी की एक बूंद से शुरू होती है, एक बूंद सहसा गिरी। चार किरदार हैं, अलग अलग वक्त में फैले हुए, और चारों आपस में एक साथ जुड़ते हैं। एक किरदार एक राजा है जो ईसा से 600 सदी पहले पैदा होता है मेसोपोटामिया की सभ्यता में, टिग्रिस नदी के किनारे। नाम है अब अशूरबनीपाल, दैट्स द नेम ऑफ द किंग, एसीरियन किंग है वो। दूसरा जो किरदार है वो किंग आर्थर का है। तीसरा किरदार है नरिन का, एक यजीदी लड़की है। चौथा किरदार है जलीखा का, जो एक साइंटिस्ट है और लंदन में पानी के बारे में पढ़ाई कर रहा है। और इसके ज़रिए बहुत कमाल की कहानी, जिसमें थोड़ा सा मैजिक रियलिज्म है, थोड़ी सी हिस्ट्री है, थोड़ी सी मेमोरी है, बहुत सारी ट्रेजेडी है। अब तक की बातचीत मैं आपसे हिंदी में कर रहा हूं क्योंकि मैं आप दर्शकों से मुखातिब हूं, लेकिन इसके बाद आई विल स्पीक इन इंग्लिश। मैं इंग्लिश में बात करूंगा क्योंकि यही वो कॉमन लैंग्वेज है जो मुझे और एलिफ को दोनों को आती है। दर्शक ध्यान दें, एलिफ की पहली लैंग्वेज टर्किश है, शी इज़ फ्रॉम टर्किश ओरिजिन। बाद में उन्होंने स्पेनिश भी सीखी, इंग्लिश भी सीखी, वैसे ही जैसे मेरी पहली भाषा बुंदेली है, फिर मैंने हिंदी सीखी और उसके बाद अंग्रेजी सीखी। Elif Shafak, it's an honor and privilege to interview you on our show Kitabwala. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's such a pleasure for me.
Before we start talking about the book, have you ever been to India?
I am so embarrassed to say no, and I feel very connected to the people, the culture. I received some of the most moving letters that I have ever received from they came from India. So I feel very connected to the people, and hopefully soon I will be visiting.
Yeah, it will be an honor for us that when you come here and we get to interact with you one-on-one in front of camera, in front of audience. And let me tell you one personal thing before we start talking about the book and your literary journey. Last evening, I was in my home, I was in my study, and my elder brother, Professor Amit Gupta, he's a very renowned trauma surgeon. So he came back home after watching a musical concert, and I informed him and a couple of other friends who were accompanying him that I'm going to interview you. They all started screaming, "What? Are you sure? Are you really gonna do it?" And they're so happy. So thank you so much. You are very popular. You are a rock star for us.
Oh, that means the world to me. I feel very connected to the young people in India, the women, readers from all ages, all backgrounds. And I think it's more than an intellectual connection. There's also an emotional connection for me, heart to heart. So everything you said really means a lot to me. Thank you.
And as I was mentioning before we started recording this interview, that my wife, Gunjan, she's a big fan of your body of work. In fact, in our bedroom, on our bedside table, there are 2 to 3 novels of yours. And she has bombarded me with her questions. So my first question is actually being asked by my wife. And she is asking that you talk about generational trauma. You talk about cultural amnesia. In a world so full of noise, how do you distinguish between meaningful silence and the dangerous silence which is trying to conspire something cruel? Because you adhere a lot on this. The pauses, the silence, because we are surrounded with the problem of plenty. There's so much information, little knowledge, and very less wisdom.
First of all, thank you. May I thank your wife? This is such a beautiful question, and it's a question that matters a lot to me, because I think as a writer, as a storyteller, I'm not only interested in stories, but also in silences. Anyone who has been silenced and pushed to the periphery and feels like they are being left voiceless, there's a part of me that organically goes in that direction. I think literature has the ability to bring the periphery to the center, to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized, to make the invisible a little bit more visible, and to make the unheard better heard. I'm not interested in the center, the glamorous. I'm interested in the forgotten. And I come from a country, Turkey, that has a very long and rich history, but that does not translate into strong memory. If anything, it's quite the opposite. In Turkey, we're a society of collective amnesia. Our entire relationship with the past is full of ruptures. So the history that is being taught at school to us is mostly his story, meaning the story. But the moment you ask, where are the stories of women? What was life like for a peasant woman or a concubine or a prostitute? In the Ottoman Empire, there's a big silence. What was life like for men who had no access to power? There's a big silence. What was life like for, an Armenian silversmith, for an Arab peasant, for a Jewish miller, the minorities at the time? Again, there's a big silence. So all I'm trying to say is, to be a writer from such a background is a bit like, you have to be like an archaeologist, linguistic and cultural archaeologist. You need to dig deep through layers of forgotten stories. I'm always interested in buried stories or forgotten ones. So that kind of silence is not good, right? Because stories bring us together, but silences keep us apart. There's another type of silence which is constructive, peaceful, but we have to differentiate these two, and maybe we need a new word. One word is not enough to describe these different types of silences.
When I was reading this book, there are rivers in the sky. On the page number 9, there's a very important passage. For the king knows that in order to dominate other cultures, you must capture not only their lands, crops, and assets, but also their collective imagination, their shared memories. Often it has been said that if we preserve our memory, it will help us in resisting, be it the colonial expansion, be it any kind of assertion on your cultural or any kind of human values. How do you look at memory as a tool, and why is it so important for us, the people of letters, to preserve the memory?
Absolutely. I observe many families who are either immigrants or have experienced some kind of displacement or some kind of trauma, come from complex backgrounds. And there's one thing that always draws my attention. There are generational differences in how we respond to memory and amnesia or forgetting. So the elderly usually are the ones who have suffered the biggest hardships. They have not forgotten the past. Of course they haven't, but they do not talk about the past. They don't even know how to talk about it. It just sits inside their chest, unspoken, all those memories. The second generation, broadly speaking, they're not that interested in the past. They don't have the time for it. They don't have the energy for it because they have to be future-oriented, forward-looking. They need to find their feet, build a new life. Tabula rasa. It has to be a new beginning. But interestingly, that leaves the third or the fourth generations in these families. The youngest people in these families today are the ones who are asking the deepest questions about ancestral heritage. What happened to their great-grandparents? And they are curious not only about family stories, but also family silences. I believe in every family, there's at least one memory keeper. And I also believe that writers are the memory keepers of their societies, of their time. And this is important not because we want to be stuck in the past, of course not, but we have to understand the past. We have to honor the complexity, the diversity of the past. Hopefully we need to learn from the past. What we cannot remember, we cannot repair. And if we cannot repair, it will keep coming back again and again. So memory is also important for healing, for individual and collective healing. And literature, I think, helps us to heal.
We weave poems, songs, and stories out of every breath. May you remember us.
Indeed. And imagine this is the oldest form of art is the ancient art of storytelling. It is universal. It does not belong to one single ethnicity or religion or class. It is the shared value of all humanity. It goes beyond borders. It transforms us. If I may give you one example that means a lot to me. In my new novel, There Are Rivers in the Sky, I also talk about the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is one of the oldest pieces of literature that we know in human history. And imagine this poem was transmitted orally. So from grandparents to grandchildren, it was told before it was written down by scribes on clay tablets, which means that it is actually much, much older than we think it is. So just imagine, ever since this poem was written down and put in the library of King Ashurbanipal, so many empires have come and gone. So many mighty kings have perished. And even the tallest monuments have crumbled to dust. But a poem made of breath and made of words, has survived the tides of history. And here we are, thousands of years later, still reading this poem, still talking about this poem and learning from it. So all I'm trying to say is literature has a very gentle and quiet, but a very, very profound power. It is resilient, it is transformative, and it belongs to all humanity equally.
Wow. I'm like that greedy kid in a candy shop, that which one should I pick? Because each and every response of yours is opening so many doors of curiosity. It's reminding me of one of the sentence you uttered long back: water remembers, it is humans who forget.
That is so true, in my opinion. As human beings, we like to believe that time is always linear, that tomorrow is going to be more developed and somehow better than yesterday. But actually, there's no such guarantee. In truth, I think time can go in different directions. It can even go backwards, in the sense that sometimes countries can slide backwards. Again, if I may give you an example, when you focus on the journey of a tree or a river or a mountain, I think nature has so much to teach us, but it makes us question this notion of linear time. For instance, the River Thames in the UK is just this remarkable, beautiful river, isn't it? But it's a zombie river. Why is it a zombie? Because not that long ago, 150 years ago, it was declared biologically dead because of the way human beings have mistreated the river, filled it with sewage and filth, and treated horribly, to such an extent that scientists at the time concluded that from now on, this river is dead. No biospecies can live in it. And yet here we are, the River Thames has renewed itself, cleaned up itself, and today it is home to more than 200 biospecies, which we should admire and respect, but we don't. We don't learn from history. And as we are speaking right now, in the UK, water companies, in the name of money, in the name of greed and profit, they are once again pumping sewage back into the Thames. So when you take the story of a river, it makes you question this notion of linear history. Do we as human beings really, really learn from history, or are we sometimes drawing circles within circles?
And when I was reading your body of work, it's very political, and this is very endearing for me that through stories and fables, you are helping us to understand the complexity of our time. And my next question is related to that, because this epic of Gilgamesh, this king called Ashurbanipal, they're not some distant character from the past. They are in our present in various shapes and forms and with new names. How do you look at the current world order, which talks about compassion, empathy at all the big stages, but it does not reflect in their actions? It was very shocking to read that the king who is preserving knowledge, who is taking great pride in the library, accumulation of knowledge, orders to burn his tutors.
Ashurbanipal is such an interesting king. So we're talking about ancient Assyria, thousands of years back, ancient Mesopotamia. And of course, understandably, in today's world, we mostly focus on very sad, heartbreaking news coming from the region. But we need to bear in mind that this was a very diverse region as you go back in time, and it still is. And this was home to wealthy empires, very complex irrigation systems, libraries, and so on. So Ashurbanipal ascends to the throne as the most cultured and learned intellectual king that the empire has ever seen. But the fact that he's cultured does not necessarily mean he's nice or he's less cruel. And actually, he is a very, very cruel king. So that dilemma is something that intrigues me. But I guess if I may take a step back, what I can tell you is I love learning. I think every writer needs to be two things all our lives. We need to be good readers, curious readers, and we need to read across the board. Let's read fiction and nonfiction. I've never believed in this distinction between highbrow literature and lowbrow literature. Who makes those distinctions, right? Let's read cookbooks. Cookbooks are wonderful. Let's read political philosophy. Let's read history. Let's read neuroscience. Let's definitely read fiction. Inside fiction, everything that's inside life can be inside a work of fiction. And also inside a novel, there's emotional intelligence. There's empathy. And I don't know a single human being in this world, whether we be designers or students or politicians or teachers, whatever we do in life, I don't know a single human being who does not need to connect with their emotions. So fiction actually brings us closer to truth, and it does it in its own way. And as writers, I believe we need to be good readers and we need to be good listeners. I love listening to people. I love listening to what they're saying, but also the gaps between their words, the silences, the pauses, the emotions that they attach. So all I'm trying to say is to keep the curiosity of the mind alive is very important, I think, for literature. And the other thing that I find very important is bridge building. Can we be bridge builders? In my work, there are political questions, but I don't like it when writers try to preach or teach or lecture, You cannot do that. And I don't know the answers myself. All I know is I care about the questions. Can I create an open space of plurality? And then I have to leave the answers to the reader. Every reader is going to come up with their own answers, and I will respect that. But I think it's a novelist's job to ask questions about silences, to try to be a bridge builder in such a badly divided world.
Elif, before I move to your writing process, because there are a lot of queries when we posted the card that you are going to appear on our book show, people were very intrigued or curious about it. You have done your PhD in political science, you teach as well. Your homeland, if I may call it, Turkey, it has one kind of regime. People call it totalitarian regime, where there's no scope for dissent or democracy. Others disagree with it. You are not in Turkey, you are in UK. In the book, at one point of time, you are talking about the Yazidi plight through a girl, through a character, and the whole situation, that how in any civilization or in any country, how minorities are being treated, how the plurality is being maintained or destroyed. But at the same time, you're talking about the British colonial hangover, the kind of oppression they have done. So you're reminding them of their past. Have you ever felt any kind of political pressure while living in UK or any other country that I have to be careful if I'm going to criticize, how will it be received? Is there a factor that the kind of time and space you are living in, how will it appear and how the regime will react to it?
It's not easy to be a novelist in Turkey, and I think it's even harder to be a female novelist in Turkey. That is the truth, because whatever you write about, from politics to history to sexuality to gender, you can offend the authorities in Turkey. This has been my experience. In 2006, I was put on trial in Turkey for insulting Turkishness, quote unquote. We have an article in the Constitution that protects Turkishness against insults, even though nobody quite knows what that means. And this article had been used against journalists and some scholars in the past, but never ever before against a fiction writer. So I found myself in a very surreal situation. I had written a book called The Bastard of Istanbul, which tells the story of a Turkish family and an Armenian-American family. And it talks about the past. It talks about memory, amnesia, and it tells the story through the eyes of women. So when the book was put on trial, the words of fictional characters were used as evidence in the courtroom, as a result of which my Turkish lawyer had to defend my Armenian fictional characters. It was very Kafkaesque. And throughout that year, it lasted for over a year. There were groups on the streets burning EU flags and spitting out my pictures, calling me a traitor. Years later, I was investigated again by a prosecutor, this time for the quote-unquote crime of obscenity, because I write issues like gender violence, child brides, which in my opinion means child abuse. These are the realities of the land where I come from. So instead of doing something about these problems, instead of opening shelters for victims of domestic violence, changing the laws, the fact that authorities can go after fiction writers is just surreal. I moved to the UK after the trial of the Bastard of Istanbul because I needed freedom. Writers need freedom of speech. It's our oxygen. And as you can hear in my accent, I am not a native speaker. English is not my mother tongue. It's an acquired language for me. but somehow I also wanted to migrate into the English language. That gave me a cognitive distance, and I felt a bit more free to write within the English language, despite its challenges. That said, to this day, if my writing has melancholy, longing, loss, I find these emotions easier to express in Turkish. But when it comes to humor, satire, sarcasm, or irony maybe, I find these things much easier to express in English. And I love humor. If I may very quickly add this as well, in England, in the UK, I have not experienced any kind of obstacles in terms of what I want to write. However, there are some glass walls in the publishing industry, and those glass walls are also real. When you are a non-Western author in this publishing world, you're easily put into one box and expected to write stories from that box of identity. And I don't like that. For me, writing is transcendental, you know? For instance, if you happen to be an Afghan women writer, almost no one expects you in this publishing world in the West, almost no one expects you to write sci-fi or avant-garde or experimental fiction. You're only expected to write about the problems of women in Afghanistan. Please don't get me wrong. This is very important, and it must be written about. It must be amplified, you know, the stories of Afghan women for sure. But my point is, an Afghan women writer might write a book about Afghan women in one novel, but maybe the next novel is going to be about something else. So that kind of freedom, that kind of flexibility is sometimes not given to those of us who are coming from different parts of the world. And I think we need to challenge and dismantle these dualities that we're pushed into. And we need to see those glass walls of the publishing industry as well.
That's a very important point. You had mentioned in your response about the Bastard of Istanbul. The ethnic responsibility of remembering is very important. I want to ask something personal. As an author, when you go through that trauma again while writing, how do you deal with it? I want to understand the mental construct. Do you simultaneously go for therapy sessions? Do you meditate? What do you do? Because constantly writing about a very important subject, which is the pain, the agony, the suffering of the marginalized, but it takes a toll on your own health as well.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And it wouldn't be truthful if I tell you that I wasn't affected at all. You know, the trial period was very unsettling for me. I found it hard, sad. At the same time, I really don't want to paint a completely bleak picture. And maybe that's the irony or the complexity of countries like Turkey, because there's also civil society. There's so many readers in Turkey from all backgrounds who genuinely love books. And if they like a novel, they share it. So on average, the same copy is being read by at least 5 or 6 people. I have seen books of mine colored, underlined by different colored pens because different people have read it, you know, and then they shared it. So that word of mouth, that sharing, that love that comes from the readers is very precious for me. However, I think the politics and the political side is quite depressing. And as a writer, sometimes you need to be very careful because it can lead to self-censorship. You know, we might end up thinking, well, what will happen if I touch this subject or that subject? And we need to stop that self-censorship. Otherwise, we cannot write. We need to be free as authors. So what I do is when I start a novel, I try to remain in that imaginary world for as long as I can and as deep as I can. That world becomes my reality. Those imaginary characters become my companions, you know. I live with them and I forget the so-called real world. And I cannot think about what will readers say, what will authorities in Turkey say, then I cannot write. So I only and only stay in my imaginary zone until the book is done. When I hand the novel to my editor, then I can have anxiety attacks and panic attacks. But by then it's too late. The book is born and it's independent of me and it's free, as it should be always. So I think we need to prioritize freedom of speech, freedom of imagination. And if there's one thing that is much stronger than all my anxieties and worries, and I really mean it, that is my love for the art of storytelling. That love is much stronger and deeper than anything else.
Yeah. A lot of female readers ask this question, including my wife, that when they read your books, especially they mention the three daughters of Eve, they take a lot of time while reading and absorbing, because initially they take some time to figure it out that authoritarianism and patriarchy, they often mirror each other. So the notion to control a woman's body and the notion to control a nation, they're almost parallel. And at times, like, she's talking about the female protagonist or she is talking about her time and the nation. This must be a constant effort and a very conscious effort to do that. How do you look back at the three daughters of Eve and the kind of responses you got for that narrative?
You know, in the case of the three daughters of Eve, I have three young characters who all struggle with this notion of faith and doubt, but who approach it from different angles. So one of them is more religious, the other one is more atheist, and the third is someone who calls herself as the confused, right? And she's confused about many things and still thinking. But all of them are on a journey, as we all are. And perhaps there's a little bit of each and every one of them in all of us. Or in life we go through stages. Maybe in our youth we feel differently, then as we get older we feel differently. So we all go through seasons. I like it when faith and doubt challenge each other or speak to each other. I find it very scary when there are absolute certainties. Doubt is a healthy thing, you know. One should have doubts. We should also doubt ourselves. We shouldn't be 100% absolutely certain of our truth. Just leave the door open. I like proper intellectual exchange. Here in the UK, unfortunately, the word intellectual is used as a negative thing, as if it's a sign of arrogance. I completely disagree. You know, Susan Sontag has this beautiful description of the life of an intellectual or the intellect, and she says two things. She says an appreciation for plurality, right? And for critical thinking. We need these things in today's world. We need an appreciation for plurality, nuance, multiplicity, and we need critical thinking. So in all these respects, I find literature very important. I try not to dictate anything. This is not how I write. I only know that I care about the questions and the characters and the story. There are issues that are very close to my heart, but that doesn't mean that I'm trying to impose these things in a novel. The art of storytelling would not allow that. So, as mentioned before, a writer's job is to build up open spaces of nuance and multiplicity, which are welcoming spaces. And then you have to leave the answers to the reader. And in that sense, I'm very happy that more and more, when I look at literary festivals, book events, many young men are also reading fiction in today's world. And that means so much to me, because the doors of fiction, of a novel, is open to everyone. And if I may add this very quickly, as you mentioned earlier, we live in an age in which we are bombarded by snippets of information, right? There's too much information, but very little knowledge and even less wisdom. Information, particularly a surplus of information, is a dangerous thing. It makes us arrogant. It gives us the illusion that we know a little bit about everything. We forgot to say, I don't know. I don't know was the beginning of philosophy. I don't know was the beginning of genuine exchanges. I don't know, but I'm here to learn. So I think in today's world, we need to spend less time with information, but more time with knowledge. And hopefully, let's try to increase our wisdom. For knowledge, we need cultural conversations. We need podcasts, slow journalism, literary festivals, books. And for wisdom, the heart has to be in the conversation. Wisdom requires emotional intelligence and empathy. So I'd rather focus on knowledge and wisdom instead of snippets or morsels of information.
And probably that is why all your books keep challenging the notion of singularity, because you persistently question the very notion of having a fixed identity. I mean, why do we have to have conflict between, say, East and West, say, modernity and conservative approach, rationalism versus mysticism? And even in this new novel, there's one character who is dealing with shamans and some old rituals. There's one character who's dealing with some scientific new discoveries, new inventions. It's very intriguing to explore this intersectionality, because once we realize that, then only we'll understand that all the cultural superpowers or the market superpowers, they keep asserting about single identity, the most assertive identity, and then you weave your narrative around it rather than dwelling in that intersectionality where you are a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Absolutely. And we live in a world that does not appreciate diversity, and it does not allow us to celebrate our own multiplicity. But as human beings, as Walt Whitman beautifully said, we all contain multitudes, wherever we might be coming from. When I look at myself, of course, I'm Turkish, and being Turkish is a big part of my writing, right? But at the same time, I feel connected to the Balkans. I have elements in my soul from the Middle East that I will always carry with me. At the same time, I consider myself European by birth, the values that I share. Over the years, I've become British, and I feel very connected to this country, you know. And despite what politicians have been telling us in the UK during this Brexit saga, the politicians in this country, they've been saying, if you're a citizen of the world, it means you're a citizen of nowhere. That's what they said, and I completely disagree. We can be a citizen of the world, a citizen of humankind, and at the same time love our countries, love our heritage. These things can go hand in hand. Every human being is very complex. We are parents, but also the children of our parents. We are neighbors. We hold jobs. We have our own ancestral heritage. When you look at a human being, it's layer upon layer upon layer. Why not celebrate that multiplicity? Why suppress it? I do not believe that identity is a singular, monolithic, static block. I would rather think of identity as water-like, like ripples in water. And actually, there are many ancient Greek philosophers who talked about identity precisely in these terms. So when you look at the ripples in the water, there's the inner circle, which is our family, and then there's another circle around it, our neighbors, our friends, the people in our own town, the people in our region, the people in our country, and then it becomes bigger and bigger until it reaches the outer circle, which is we are citizens of one human race, one humankind. And all those circles can go hand in hand. Literature allows us to celebrate multiplicity, unlike social media.
Reminded me of one of your interview last year when you were talking about Cervantes' Don Quixote. And how it opened up the door of imagination for you, that so many realities, multiple realities and multiple contradictions can coexist within a novel.
That is so true. And I think novels show us that there are other possibilities, other ways of existence. I really mean it when I say books can save us, books can change us. Why do I say this? Because it happened to me. I experienced this. I thought, when I look at my own childhood, I was raised by a single working mother. At the time in Turkey, it was very unusual. I grew up without seeing my father. I met my half-brothers much later in life, in my 20s. And partially I was raised by a grandmother who was a bit of a storyteller. So it's these two women who raised me. But there were moments in my youth when I thought life was so boring. And it was books that showed me beyond my little corner of the universe, there are other possibilities. Connect with people who might seem to be different at first glance, but actually they're not that different. For literature, in the land of storyland, there is no such thing as us versus them. There is no such thing as the other. The other is my brother. The other is my sister. I am the other. Literature dismantles these polarizations and dualities that we otherwise take for granted in life.
While you were responding to this query, it reminded me of two sets of your grandmothers, very different from each other. Would you like to tell us about them? Because they clearly left a lasting impression on you, in a good or a bad way.
That is so true. Actually, I was raised by my maternal grandmother. Until I was about 10 years old. My encounter with my paternal grandmother was more limited. So I wrote an essay about that summer, and they were completely different women. My paternal, when you look at the first glance, when you look at them, they come from similar age groups, backgrounds. They're both Turkish, they're both Muslim, but their interpretation of everything really was completely different. My paternal grandmother's main emotion and the way she connected with God was based on fear. So she talked a lot about hell and, being punished and sin. And there was a lot of fear in her narrative or in her daily talk. My other grandmother who raised me, my maternal grandmother, was quite the opposite. I think her main emotion was love. And to me, even as a child, it was so interesting to observe how these two women saw the world in such different ways. If I may share this very quickly, I was born in France, but my parents got separated. And then my mother brought me to Turkey. Of course, for her, it was motherland. But for me, it was a new country altogether, even though I was very young. And my mother had made a mistake in the sense that she had quit. She had dropped out of university thinking that love was all she needed in life. But when her marriage did not work out, when my parents got separated, my mom came back to Turkey without money, without a career, with no diploma, nothing to fall back on. And at the time, young divorcees in such situations would be immediately married off to someone older. We came to my maternal grandmother's house. This was a very patriarchal, very inward-looking, and a very, very conservative neighborhood. So immediately the neighbors were trying to find a suitable older husband for my mother. And it was my grandmother who intervened, and she said, no, my daughter should go back to university. She should have a career, choices in life. She can always get married again, but it will be her choice, not someone else's imposition. And that changed our lives. So off my mother went, and I stayed with grandma, and she raised me until I was 10 years old. Grandma was not a very well-educated person, only because she herself had been pulled out of school in Turkey at the time for being a girl. And she wholeheartedly believed in women's education. She wholeheartedly believed in women's independence. And she taught me that you might not have a fancy diploma on the wall, but you can still be a very wise human being. Or you might graduate from a very posh college or university, but you can still be ignorant in life. There are different paths to knowledge. And so she made me understand that within oral culture, there are so many pockets of wisdom. Even our superstitions are the projections of our deepest fears. They come from somewhere. That's why I think, to the best of my ability, I would love my fiction to be a bridge builder between written culture and oral culture.
We are running short of time, but I have 4 or 5 questions left. I've trimmed my list. Readers asked a very simple question. What's your process of writing? You do a lot of research first, a lot of notes, because you have certain characters in your mind, so accordingly you will do the research work, then you'll start reading, or you'll just go with the flow? How does it work in Elif Shafak's case? Or it varies from book to book?
I think, broadly speaking, there are two different ways of writing a novel. One is more cerebral. It's a bit like engineering or mathematical, in which the author wants to be in charge, in control, and wants to know how every character is going to behave in the next 10 chapters and how the story is going to end. So everything is almost planned out previously. I have a lot of respect for authors who write this way, but it's not my way. I like the second way, in which, as an author, you are a little bit drunk. You do not know quite what you're doing, but you have a very strong intuition. Intuition is very important, you know. I like it when my characters surprise me. I do not try to dominate or control them. If they can surprise me, I'm hoping they can surprise their readers as well. However, for me to be able to feel this kind of confidence, because you're literally jumping into the water without quite knowing which way you're going, right? For me to be able to feel that free and confident, I need to do my homework well. And I do a lot of research before I start writing. I do a lot of thinking. I have notebooks. I love learning. Nothing is too small or too big. If I have to learn about the life of mosquitoes, I will learn about the life of mosquitoes. If I need to travel into ancient Mesopotamia, I'm fine. Then I will be reading. So I love interdisciplinary reading, eclectic reading lists. I think the mind is always more nourished when we dare to leave our comfort zone. When a novelist learns from neuroscience, or when a scientist learns from poetry, or when a poet learns from film theory, or when a director learns from dance, those are the conversations that really, really nourish our mind and our soul. And that's why I always try to leave my comfort zone behind. That's how I write.
Interesting. 10 minutes, 38 seconds in this strange world. Sometime back, we were talking about the particular situation back in Turkey, especially in Istanbul, and what all you faced. The kind of pressure you had to go through. You were talking about in one of the interview about that cemetery in Istanbul where the companionless people were buried. And in this novel as well, you talk about a sex worker and the way her life was eliminated. What kind of research or preparation goes while writing such narratives, while weaving such narratives? Because there's clearly, we can see the political allegiance of Elif Shafak, where she is with all the marginalized people, whether you are from LGBTQ community, where you are being suppressed by any kind of authority, you sympathize with them, you empathize with them, actually, that's the right word. Mm-hmm. So especially in context of this novel, how was the preparation? Because when I read about it, that cemetery, I was like, okay, so many numbers, so many possible stories, each graveyard, but nobody is paying attention to them. And that happens always around us.
Yeah, absolutely. So this novel, 10 minutes, 38 seconds in a strange world, tells the story of a sex worker. And right away, we know that she's dead on the very first page, you know. But the interesting thing is, even though her heart has stopped beating, her mind is still functioning for a few more minutes. There are interesting scientific studies that show after the human heart stops, the brain can remain active for up to 10 minutes. And that gave me the structure for the entire novel. So I was inspired by science. Mm-hmm. But I particularly wanted to focus on this cemetery where she ends up being buried. This is an actual cemetery in Istanbul on the outskirts. It is not the only one. And in Turkish, we call it the cemetery of the companionless, people who did not have a companion in life. But that's not true. The people who were buried there did have companions. They did have friends. So this is also a book about friendship. Now, I became very interested in the cemetery many years ago. I visited it. And since then, I've been trying to do research, and every time I could find the newspaper coverage, I kept it. It's a very sad place where actual human beings are almost dumped without a proper funeral, without any rituals or burial rites, and where actual human beings are turned into numbers. There are no tombstones there. There are no flowers, no visitors. You do not read the names of the people who are buried there. They have only become just scribbled numbers. And I think I wanted, as an author, to do the exact opposite. Can I take at least one of these numbers and rehumanize someone who has been dehumanized like that, and give her a story, and give her friends, and show that she was not companionless? If you go to this cemetery in Turkey, and if you do some research, you will find out that the people who are buried there, they come from all backgrounds. So, for instance, among them, there are so many people who were buried throughout 1980s and 1990s who died because of HIV-related diseases. And because of the stigma of AIDS, their families rejected them, and so they ended up buried in the cemetery of the companionless. There are also sex workers there, buried, but there are also, for instance, babies who were found on the street and who lost their lives. So abandoned babies are also there. Suicides are there. There's a growing number of refugees. We always read about refugees who have lost their lives as they were trying to cross into Europe. Where are those bodies buried? They're buried in the cemetery of the companions. So it's a very surreal place in which an Afghan refugee might be buried next to an abandoned baby, might be buried next to a sex worker, and so on. And I think my instinct was to, first of all, to pay attention to this space that almost no one talks about, that is so discarded and forgotten. And I wanted to show that sometimes we have, yes, of course, we have our blood families. And if our families are loving and caring and tender, we should all count our blessings. But not everyone is as lucky. And especially for people who have been pushed to the margins, the second family can be just as important as the blood family. And I call the second family our water families. Our water families are composed of our friends, sometimes 5 or 6, maybe not more. It can't be dozens and dozens. But these are the people who know us, who love us, and they are the witnesses of our journeys. When we fall down, they pull us up, and we do the same for them. So my observation is, especially in countries like Turkey, where lots of minorities, particularly LGBTQ plus minorities, are pushed to the periphery, especially for them, water families are so important. And I also wanted to talk about that.
Interesting. When I was coming for this interview, one of the reader friend remarked that melancholy is a common theme in her writing. She talks about suffering, and there's an undercurrent in most of her characters, apart from love and hope in the end. So the question was, how do you unburden yourself? Do you watch stand-up comedy? When is the last time you had a heart full of laughter? And what's that process to keep yourself light while writing these sagas?
I really appreciate the question, but the way I see it, my writing, yes, has melancholy, but it also has a lot of humor. I think humor keeps us sane, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Humor is oxygen. I love humor. Not condescending humor, though. I don't like it when writers try to situate themselves above and make fun, of other people's weaknesses. Not that kind of humor, but compassionate humor. I love compassion. I love empathy. I love love. I love hope. And these are incredibly important. It's okay if the mind is more pessimistic. Actually, that is not necessarily a bad thing. We are living in the age of angst. Right now, East and West, young and old, so many people are so worried. This is the truth. The only difference is some people suppress their emotions and hide their worries more than others. But I think I would rather talk about emotions openly and honestly and treat them as sources of raw energy. So Toni Morrison has this beautiful essay in which she says, I feel so angry sometimes. But then the next line goes like this: I go and sit down at my desk and I write. I love that because she takes that anger and she turns it into something more positive for herself, for her community, and for humanity. So the question is not whether we are sad or worried or anxious or angry, but what do we do with these raw emotions? Can we turn them into something more positive? And that is something that I care about a lot. I care about 3 connections. One is we need to reconnect with our fellow human beings beyond borders. That is something that gives me strength. We should not be atomized individuals. Apathy is a dangerous thing. The second thing that I find important is connecting with nature, learning from trees, from water, from mountains. We're so arrogant. We turned ourselves into consumers of nature, but actually we're a very small part of a very delicate ecosystem. So we have a lot to learn from nature. That's the second connection that I find very important. And the third connection is a spiritual one. I think we need to take good care of our inner garden. We all have an inner garden inside. So if we can rebuild these 3 connections with each other, with nature, and within, that might also give us hope and strength.
Wow. It almost reminded me of the 40 rules of love and that Sufism approach, having a link with the outside world and with the inner world. So people walk up to you when you go to book discussion shows or book fairs, and do they inquire about the notion of love, that how Elif Shafak looks at this phenomena called love?
Love is the core of our universe, isn't it? It transforms us. It's the best teacher. You kindly pointed out that Sufism, I would not necessarily call myself a Sufi.
I was just talking about the theme of that particular book, the 40 Rules of Love.
You're absolutely right. I'm interested in these ancient philosophies, ancient poetry. I'm interested in the dance of faith and doubt, in the dance of melancholy and humor. I'm interested in the human journey. I love the word empathy, the original meaning in German. When we look at the etymology of the word, it means to journey into someone else's story and try to feel that person, how they feel, try to see the world through their eyes. This is a very good exercise. It's a very good humbling exercise for the soul, not only for the mind, but for the heart as well. So I do hope and I do believe that literature brings us closer to truth. It brings us closer across borders. And I am hoping that in today's unfortunately badly broken and bitterly politicized world, our need for literature is going to grow bigger. The faster this world spins, the bigger our need to slow down, hear each other, listen to each other, and to learn from the ancient art of storytelling.
Thank you so much, Elif Shafak. Last question of this conversation. Books you would love to recommend, books which had a lasting impression on you as a teenager, as a young woman, books you think everybody or people who are curious about the surroundings should read. Elif Shafak's book recommendation.
I struggle to answer this question only because when I look at the books that influenced me, it's so eclectic. In my grandmother's house, there weren't so many books. She didn't have a massive library. She had few books. And I would read them and reread them, imagining different endings for the same books. Then when we moved to Spain with my mother and I started learning Spanish and English, a whole new world opened up for me. This time I started discovering Spanish novels, including Don Quixote, which we referred to earlier, but then English literature. But my point is, I've been reading from very different parts of the world and different genres. The novel is where my heart beats. Fiction, I think, holds all these pieces together. But in addition to fiction, I love reading poetry. I love reading political philosophy. Everything is connected. The essential thing, I think, is to keep the curiosity alive.
Yes.
Let's find time. Let's make the time for books. And let's also make sure that we don't only read the same kind of books over and over again, but let's also please make room for fiction, because fiction heals us and makes us understand the importance of emotional intelligence. It also is very diverse and nuanced. I think it brings us closer not only to truth, but also to our own truth. It makes us discover ourselves, who we are. So there's a lot that fiction can give us. And I passionately believe in that.
Thank you so much. किताबवाला में आप सुन रहे हैं एलिफ शफक को द रिवर्स इन द स्काई, ये कमाल का उपन्यास जो पेंगुइन ने छापा है। इसके पहले जो बहुत चर्चित किताब रही द 40 रूल्स ऑफ लव, 3 Daughters of Eve, 10 minutes 38 seconds in this strange world, और इसके अलावा एक और जो बहुत चर्चित किताब है जिसके बारे में मैं इनसे सवाल नहीं पूछ पाया, एडा की कहानी, कैसे उसके डीएनए में दुख बरपा हुआ है, द आइलैंड ऑफ मिसिंग ट्रीज। आप एलिफ शफक को ज़रूर पढ़ें। एलिफ, I was telling my viewers about your body of work, what all you have written so far, and in the last I just want to express my gratitude. It's an honor to listen what you said about intersectionality, what you said about identities, what you said about suffering, love, humor, and the power of fiction, the power of stories. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you so much. I'm very grateful.
This was such a joy, such a pleasure for me. I'm very grateful. Thank you so much. And hopefully next time in person in India.
I was about to say that India is eagerly waiting to receive its beloved author. Thank you so much.
Means a lot. Thank you so much. Lots of love.
Thank you. Thank you so much.